All right, so welcome to the Central Asia lecture. Hopefully you can see a map, a little red arrow floating around on it. And basically there are 5 countries, a little bit of an introduction. So for taking notes, if you just sort of split your notes up into the 6 main areas, we'll talk about the introduction, and then we'll do Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, in that order. So these are the countries that we're going to talk about today. These ones we've done a little work about before. The map for Central Asia will actually be tested when we do our South Asia map. So we're not going to do the map right away. We will have the content test on Russia and the Caucasus and Central Asia on Thursday. So we'll do a review activity on Wednesday. We'll have the lecture today. So to start out with, maybe we'll advance to the next slide. Yes, start with Genghis Khan. So he is the founder of the biggest land empire in the world. He's a Mongol ruler. So he comes from what is today called Mongolia, north of China, part of northern China. And he expanded his territory across all of what is today pretty much down from China to Hungary. And when he died, his empire split up into 4 different parts. And so we can look at that here between 4 of his sons. So eventually these people are obviously more Chinese, ruled by a guy by the name of Kublai Khan. We have the Golden Horde, which is the area that we'll deal with more about. Here's Kiev and Moscow. Actually, I think Moscow should be more up here on this map. But we talked about how they came and caused these guys problems. So this is what is today Central Asia. We have here Samarkand, which was the important city at that point. So here's how big the Aral Sea was at then. This is the Baikal Sea here in Kazakhstan. So this is the area we're looking at today. And the most famous of Genghis Khan's descendants for this area is Tamerlane, otherwise known as Timur the Lame. And he ruled a bit later than Genghis Khan, but he ruled all of from Turkey to India. His capital was at Samarkand in Uzbekistan, and this is his grave. And there's an interesting story about him that we knew where his grave was, and we knew that he was most likely buried there. And in 1941, a bunch of Soviet archaeologists decided, oh, let's go dig up his grave and see what he was really like. And we can see, was he really lame, et cetera, et cetera. And so supposedly on his tomb, which is beneath this structure here, was written, whoever opens my tomb will unleash this terrible plague upon the world. And like 3 days after they opened his tomb, Hitler invaded Russia. And so they say, yep, that's what caused World War II, is that they opened up Tamerlane's tomb. Probably isn't actually true, but it's a good story. Anyway, Tamerlane is the one who sort of consolidated this huge Central Asian empire, a portion of what was the Mongol Empire. When we get to South Asia, we'll look again at people like Babar, who went in and founded also the Mughal Empire of India, which is a cousin of this empire that Tamerlane founded. So during this time, Central Asia was very important on this Silk Road. And this is a way that basically you had these expensive goods that were available in China, in particular silk, since the name of it, would come along and they would make their way eventually to the European markets off through what is today Arabia, eventually into Venice. And you wouldn't necessarily have one person that would start in Baghdad and work their way all the way along. Instead, you had a series of traders. So people from Shanghai would trade to these guys, they would take it to those guys, etc., all across. And the most difficult part was once you left the make it through this area of deserts and mountains. Here's the Tian Shan Mountains, here's the Pamir Mountains. Then you get, here you have the Hindu Kush and the parts of the Himalaya Mountains here. So this was the pass that you could sneak through between these. You have the Taklamakan, you have the Karakum, and all of these very difficult areas. So you had this series of stops along the way, which would be safe trading places. If you could make it from Kashgar to Osh, if you could make it from Osh to Samarkand, Samarkand to Bukhara, etc., then you knew that if I could make it across this desert, that would be a safe place for me to hand it on to the next trader. And this is sort of where this area can look back to its original importance. Now we come to the 1800s, and we have two large empires in the works. On the left, we have the Russian bear, and on the right, we have the British lion, and they are drooling over these Central Asian. At that point, they mainly called the area either Turkestan or Afghanistan, and they wanted it. And so Russia was coming in from the north because they wanted to expand their power down south, as we've looked at before. Britain, their crown jewel, was India, and they wanted to defend India from Russia. So they were working their way north. They also knew that there were, by this point in the late 1800s, they knew there was valuable oil in northern, what is today Iran. Back then they called it Persia. And so this area of Central Asia became important as a buffer. And this time when Russia and Britain didn't actually go to war against each other, but they played each other off, and they bought and begged and bribed the local rulers and fought the local rulers and did allies, the great game. And we have a little video here, 3-minute history. You don't need to worry about the names, but the maps are kind of important, shows how British influence expanded north and Russian influence expanded south. Well, that didn't work. Will it play? Nope, we'll go to plan B. So hopefully you can still see this side of the screens. Way too much bandwidth. All right, we won't worry about that one. The other videos that I have are much more important. although now we're at the mercy of a very slow computer. Okay. So after, anyway, the Great Game through the 1800s, Russia eventually took over this whole area as part of the Russian Empire. The Soviet Union came along, we had that rebellion, all that sort of thing. So this became part of the Soviet Union. Let's go back one slide. Computer is not too slow. There it is. So here you can see all of Russia. They take over this area. And what they do is they would carve up these people and give them their little countries. As it mentioned in the reading we did about Georgia and such, they're trying to sort of divide and conquer in a way to keep the local tribes and ethnic groups happy. But you'll notice some of the borders, for example, here you just sort of straight line cut through. Here you have these wild and curvy things. The borders didn't really matter because it was kind of like states today in Germany or the United States, that it didn't matter where exactly you crossed from Baden-Württemberg into Hesse. And so when they became actual countries and these borders did matter, this has caused a lot of troubles, especially in this area where there's a lot of mountains, because the Soviet roads would just sort of go like that. Okay, these are the sub-political boundaries, those aren't actually the roads, regardless. And today there's problems where if you want to go, for example, from here to here, you would have to go through, the road might actually do this. And so you'd have to cross a lot of boundaries just to get from one part of Kyrgyzstan to another part of Kyrgyzstan. Or there's little enclaves and exclaves all scattered about here. And these countries were not, their infrastructure was not built in terms of being one country. They were built to be part of the Soviet Union. So let's start now with Kazakhstan. And this is the largest. This is probably the most economically successful of the countries. So some statistics. So 65% of the people in Kazakhstan are Kazakh. Actually in 1970, there were more Russian people in the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic than there were Kazakhs. But since the fall of the Soviet Union, a lot of the Russian people have re-emigrated. And you'll notice that on this map, there's different names for these countries. This is the Soviet name, or at least the most recent Soviet name, and this is the Kazakh name. And they've also changed these several times as time's gone by. So, for example, if we go to the capital, as of last March, the capital is now called Nur Sultan. It used to be called, let's see if I'm getting we missed a little bit here. So I should mention that Kazakhstan, because of it being so many people that are Russian, it was the last country to actually break away from the old Soviet Union. Russia even broke away from the Soviet Union before Kazakhstan did. And so the capital during the Soviet time was down here in what is today called Almaty. And during the Soviet times, that was called Alma-Ata. And you'll notice on some of the different maps that I'm using, this is called Alma-Ata, sometimes it's called Almaty. And then after Kazakhstan became independent, they decided, oh, we should probably move the capital up here. The reason they gave, supposedly, is that there was no more room to build more suburbs. Okay, well, that's not true. It's vast steppes. Probably what people think is that this area here was mostly Russian ethnically. This is where the Russians had moved in. This had been part of the Russian Empire since the 1800s. And the Kazakhs wanted to bring more ethnically Kazakh people up here by moving their capital further north. And that has definitely happened. So they moved it up here. So this town was called Akhmoli, and then it became Tsalingrad after the Russians took over. And then it became Akmola until the 1990s when they decided to move the capital there. And then they simply named it Capital City, which is Astana. And so a lot of your maps, a lot of the things that will say that the capital of Kazakhstan is Astana, which was true until a little over a year ago, when the ruler, whose first name is Nur Sultan, decided that, oh, I'm going to retire. And he then made it so that when he retired, lo and behold, 3 days later, the country decided, oh, in honor of him, we'll name our capital after his first name. And so, yeah, so it'd be like people say, oh, we love George Bush so much, we're going to rename our capital George. So yes, the capital of Astana, of Kazakhstan, for the moment, is Nur Sultan. I very much expect that when he dies, it will go back to being Astana. Okay, so here is Nur Sultan himself. And he is basically a dictator. This picture of him was taken actually a month ago or so. And compared to the rest of Central Asia, he is not overly personally corrupt, but all of Central Asia has corruption problems. He is, however, very much in the old school that I am a Central Asian leader, I will be the ruler of this country for life. And so there's very little personal, very little religious freedom in Kazakhstan. So this fellow took over the presidency of Kazakhstan in 1990, and supposedly he resigned in 2019, but he is still basically the one who runs the country. He's the president of the Security Council. He's a president for life of the Security Council. He has been given the title the leader of the people, or the eternal leader of the people. So even though he is officially retired, he's still very much the one who's in charge of the country and is basically going to rule it till his death. And the capital is obviously named Billy, if his name had been Carter, which they named it after him. And the main source of money in Kazakhstan is oil, the pipelines that run through it. So if we go back here, this area has a lot of oil. And these pipelines that were in the oil-rich regions down here would then run through Kazakhstan to get to Russia. And so this was one of their main sources of income. Now, as these countries are looking a little more to ship their oil to the West, Kazakhstan is working on thinking, okay, what are areas that we're going to do now for our own, what is it going to be that will be our own way of making money, which is something that they're not entirely sure of. Notice on this map, you can tell it's an old one. This basically has disappeared, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Kazakhstan is also the home of the Baikonur Cosmodrome. This is where Russia has been launching all of its rockets ever since the Soviet Union put Sputnik into space. The reason is because the closer you get to the equator, basically, the more you can use the Earth's spin to launch your rockets. So you're going to want your launching site to be as close to the equator as possible. That's why the US launches its rockets from Florida. The European Space Agency launches its rockets from a part of France that's actually in South America. So they launch it, the European Space Agency actually launches closest to the equator. And in the Soviet Union, Kazakhstan is pretty far south compared to the rest of Russia. This is a massive rocket launching area. And since the US stopped doing the space shuttle program, the US has also used the Baikonur Cosmodrome to send its people up to the space station. So this has been the place where all of the supplies and people to the space station have gone from since the US stopped doing the space shuttle. So even Americans fly out of here now. And it's interesting that when this was part of the Soviet Union, no big deal. Now that it is Kazakhstan, Russia has to pay rent to use this. And Kazakhstan charges them at the moment $115 million a year. Kazakhstan thinks that's way too little. Russia thinks it's way too much. So Russia is actually working on building their own new space station, space launching point just north of Kazakhstan. And Kazakhstan is trying to make as much money as possible off of this one while it's still in demand. An interesting thing about this one, because there is such a vast space of nothing around it, when these rockets go off and the various stages fall back to Earth, they're actually able to be recovered because they simply drop out in the desert and then people go and pick them up and do the recycling and recovering from them. Another interesting thing about Kazakhstan, you think of these countries down there in the desert as not being necessarily hockey countries, but Kazakhstan has made it to the Olympics a couple of times. And basically because of the Russian influence, hockey is a really big sport in Kazakhstan. There's been several Kazakh players that have actually played in the NHL. But on a personal basis, probably even more popular in Kazakhstan is bandy, which is kind of like soccer played on ice. And they use like a floor hockey ball, and they use field hockey sticks that are curved. You have 11 players on a team, you've got a big goal, and it's played, the field is the same size as a soccer field. It has very similar rules to soccer, except that you're obviously playing it on ice with hockey gear. And this is a very popular sport in Central Asia, popular in Scandinavia. It's popular in a few parts of the US, but really not nearly as much as it is in parts of Central Asia and Northern Europe. All right, this brings us to Uzbekistan. Here is a much better picture of the Aral Sea, which we will talk about in a bit. The Amudarya River, as you can tell, doesn't even reach it anymore. This used to be the size of it. And we'll talk about that eventually as well. So when we talk about Uzbekistan, it used to be called in the Greek and Roman times, this is called Bactria. And you have two types of camels. There's the dromedary camel, which has one hump. You have the Bactrian camel, which has two humps. And that is actually named after Uzbekistan. And you gotta love the camel anchor that they're using there. This is also where Alexander the Great came through. And this famous mosaic of Alexander was from a battle that he fought in what is today Uzbekistan as he was working his way toward India. So it has a history that goes back into the ancient times. So Tashkent is the capital. It is on the Silk Road, and it was once the fourth largest city in the Soviet Union. after Moscow, St. Petersburg, and Kiev. A big reason for that, not necessarily because it was a great place to live, but because if Stalin or whoever else wanted to kick people out of someplace, let's say that groups in Ukraine were causing problems, they would have forced migrations, and this would be where they would move them to. So you're going to get sent, kind of like in the old, you watch these old World War II things, and no, please don't send me to the Eastern Front, say the Germans. Well, this is where you would get sent if you were bad in the Soviet Union. So it became one of the biggest cities in the Soviet Union. Today, it is over 80% of the people in Uzbekistan are Uzbek. Only 5% are Russian. So a lot of the Russians have left Uzbekistan after the Soviet Union fell. And one of the big problems that Uzbekistan has is the Aral Sea. So this is a picture from 1989 on the left, a picture from, I believe this is 2018 on the right. And the Amu Darya used to come in here. The Shir Darya comes in here. This part of the Aral Sea, as you can tell, still exists because they built a dam across here, knowing that this was disappearing. And so basically the Aral Sea is gone. This has caused actually more problems than just simply an ocean drying up or a large lake, is that this was out in sort of the backwoods, as you were, of the Soviet Union. This island in particular was very isolated. And so the Soviets did a lot of testing of really nasty stuff on these islands in the middle of the Aral Sea. There's radioactivity, there was biological weapons testing, there's chemical weapons testing, all of these sort of things. And as the sea has dried up, you now have this incredibly contaminated sand and dust, which is blowing all over the region and causing problems far removed from the Aral Sea. In addition to the fact that you used to have all around the edge here, I should say over here, these used to be villages and cities that were based on things like fishing and trading. Well, obviously, now you're hundreds of miles from any ocean, and this is a polluted, highly saline little strip here that isn't useful for anything. Another issue in Uzbekistan is forced labor. As I mentioned a little before in the reading, the Soviet Union had a policy that each area of the Soviet Union would focus on one particular thing. And for Central Asia, that was growing cotton. And so they built these canals, they put in all of this cotton growing. This is basically desert. And these people who were moved on these forced migrations, they would be forced to work in the cotton fields. And that has continued since the Soviet Union has collapsed. Uzbekistan has real problems in terms of human trafficking, in terms of modern day slavery, people forced to work in these cotton fields, which are being irrigated by this system that is basically wreaking havoc with the entire environment. In addition, as you irrigate these fields, because they are not, the rainfall is not such that it normally cleans the land like you would in Germany or wherever, these fields, after 50 years of being irrigated, are becoming themselves too salty to support this. So this is a major environmental problem in the happening. All right, we'll move to Turkmenistan. So Turkmenistan is probably the most corrupt of any of these countries. And all of Central Asia has difficulty with corruption, has difficulty with the fact that there's been very little rule of law. when a ruler comes in, they basically look at themselves as, yep, I'm an inheritor of Genghis Khan or Tamerlane. I am now the ruler. I can do whatever I want. And they do. And so this is one area that's been holding these countries back. But Turkmenistan is by far the worst. So this is the Karakum Canal. This was built to move water from the Amu Darya into these cotton fields. And this is the main reason why the Aral Sea is drying up. It runs along the south part of Turkmenistan. And now that Turkmenistan controls this, they have all of this water. They don't really care what happens to the Aral Sea, which is on the border of Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. And so there would be no incentive for them to stop this canal and let the Aral Sea refill up, because those are two countries away from them. They're making money off of this. And these are, again, some of the laborers that are being forced to work. Here's some of the irrigation pipes that were laid during the Soviet Union's time. And basically, the country became independent in 1991, like any of them did. And the president who had been in power in 1985 under the Soviet Union basically just stayed on. So all of the systems that were in Turkmenistan when it was part of the Soviet Union just simply stayed. So Turkmenistan never became a non-communist country in that way, except for the fact that obviously Soviet communism is not real communism. It just switched into being a plain dictatorship. The Communist Party of Turkmenistan is still in power today. They simply changed their name. When the president died in 2006, another fellow came in, and he's been winning like 98% of the vote every time they have a so-called vote, because the only parties that are allowed in Turkmenistan are those who are approved by what used to be called the Communist Party. And it has one of the worst human rights records in the world. So every broadcast under the former president had to start with this little curse or a pledge that they would make that said, "May this broadcaster's tongue shrivel if I slander the country, flag, or president." And so obviously you're not going to get free news from there. So Turkmenistan has one of the world's largest natural gas resources. And this is one thing that they are trying to harness and trying to export. And their border on the south is with Iran. And then they have the Caspian Sea. They would rather not have to pay Kazakhstan to send their oil or their natural gas north. So they are working on a way of exporting it to this energy-hungry West, or the West, for good reason, is a little leery to do business with them. Now, an interesting side effect of having one of the largest natural gas things in the world is the fact that during the Soviet times, the Soviets thought, well, yes, we can put some oil wells in here. And so in the 1950s, the Soviets were drilling an oil well in an area, and they hit a gas pocket under the ground, and the ground collapsed and totally buried the drilling rig and everything. And this hole started leaking natural gas. And they thought, oh, this is bad because, you know, this natural gas could flow across the ground and there's villages around here. It could be bad for them. Let's burn off the natural gas. We expect, you know, a couple weeks from now it'll burn off. So they lit this hole on fire, hoping that the natural gas would burn off, but it hasn't. So it has been burning since the 1950s. And at times, the president has said, no, let's just go take a bunch of sand and fill it in. And now they're realizing, actually, this is sort of becoming a bit of a tourist attraction. And so this is sometimes called the door to hell, but this was actually where they had tried drilling, the drilling rigs fell in, and there's so much natural gas in the area that it just kind of seeps out of the ground. Now, if we can get this to work again, I have another video. Oh, which looks like it disappeared. We'll load it up. This is why at BFA, if you ever want to show a YouTube video, you should probably download it before. Oh, that's why it signed me out. Okay, I will put a link to this video on the site and you can check it out yourself after I get it reapproved. All right, this brings us then to, oh, one more thing about Kazakhstan, or Turkmenistan. They have the world's most complicated flag. So most flags you can actually describe. There's a special code that you use that you can then describe it, and from that description you can then draw it. Well, Turkmenistan has 5 traditional tribes, and each of them has a particular carpet pattern. And so they have incorporated each of the 5 carpet patterns into their flag, which makes this one almost impossible to just describe it and draw it from memory in that way, or draw it from the description. All right, Kyrgyzstan. So this was part of Russia in the 1870s. It then became independent. And today it is about 88% Muslim, and then that equals about 88% of the people are Kyrgyz. But interestingly enough, even though most of the people are Kyrgyz there, Russian is still the language that you speak in the streets. So people tend to speak Kyrgyz at home, but then they would go out and they would speak Russian in the shops and such as a result of the Soviet era. And this is something that is beginning to change. So the Kyrgyz government is trying to support the use of Kyrgyz. They've recently started actually using Kyrgyz in the parliament, using Kyrgyz in government instead of Russian in an attempt to make it more their own. And you can see here, this map shows well, the way that in the Soviet times, you had all of these little bits and squiggles where these roads did not necessarily match with what, for example, but no, they didn't do that. They put all of these little bits of country sticking here and there sort of willy-nilly. Kyrgyzstan is a very mountainous country. It is poor. It is hard for the government to control what happens in Kyrgyzstan. It's a border region, and there's a lot of smuggling that happens back and forth between the different countries, as people even will smuggle gasoline in vast thousands and thousands of liters. For traditionally, the people that live here didn't even worry about the border. They would sometimes move from one side of the mountains to the other, depending on where the best pasture was for the country, etc. Now, all of Central Asia has a rather interesting sport called buzkashi. And there's even attempts to make this an Olympic sport. You basically take a goat, buzkashi means grabbing the goat, and you chop off its head, chop off its lower legs, and you have to ride a horse, grab the goat from a circle, ride around a pole, and drop it back in a circle. And I have a rather old but somewhat informative video to show you about buzkashi.
Hey, Mr. Olson.
Yep.
The buzkashi isn't always done with a dead goat. Sometimes they do it with a live goat too.
With a live one? That would make extra
In
challenge.
Kazakhstan, they do.
I think in Olympic buzkashi, they actually use a calf because they're sturdy.
Yeah, it's either a goat or a cow.
No, there's different rules. I can't imagine this one ever making it as a Olympic sport. So this is taken from an older video, but it has some good footage of showing their culture. I think this is actually in Afghanistan.
The migration is over. It is 6 months later. The goat has had her baby, a healthy boy. And Mark's family have returned to their home in America. This is the time for the horse games called Bush. And Mark has kept his horse in the courtyard all summer to rest. Now he turns his attention to conditioning his horse for the coming winter games. Anvar is considered by many as one of the best horsemen in northeastern Afghanistan. For Haji Omar, there is no doubt. Afghans believe that buzkashi belongs to the horse. They say it is better to have a poor rider on a good horse than a good rider on a poor horse. For the Chapandaz, or rider, the game is a chance to express the fierce and incessant social rivalry that preoccupies Afghans. Buzkashi means goat dragging or grabbing. The field itself has no precise boundaries. The game is played with the carcass of a mated calf which is placed in a circle. This circle is the goal. At a distance, there is a pole stuck in the ground. The Chapandaz must struggle until he manages to grab the carcass. He's then supposed to go around the pole with the carcass in hand and return to the goal. If he manages to throw the carcass inside the circle, he wins a point. The problem is the other Chapandaz. The Chapandaz say that even horses develop their own rivalries and spontaneously fight against each other. There's no greater shame to a chief or horse owner than when his horse has performed badly. It is better to shoot a chief with a gun straight in the face and tell him loudly on the field that his horse is weak and not fast enough. The old carcass is taken away and the new game begins. Each horse is ridden for 10 to 15 minutes and then allowed to rest. Haji Omar has put his own son Anvar in the game to represent him. If he loses, it means great loss of prestige among his rival chiefs. Rivalry in Afghan society is likened to the Chakras. The woman is a rival woman, the shepherd is a rival shepherd, and the chief is a rival of the chief. Anwar the sheep breeder has scored a point. Educated Ishmael might be Haji Omar's hope for the future. But his preferred son is Anwar. Anwar is Haji Omar's link with the past.
Yeah, if you play that with a live goat, it's not going to stay live for long. All right, so last country here, Tajikistan. So pretty simply, so this was a country that is kind of a construction of the Soviets. So the capital Dushanbe just simply means Monday in the Farsi language. The people here are not related to the others. Most of the other people in Central Asia speak a Turkic related language. These people are actually much closer to Iranians, or what used to be called Persians. And so their language is similar to Persian, similar to Iranian. And it's a very mountainous country, very ethnically diverse, but almost entirely Muslim. And they have very little connections by road or rail to the outside countries, but the government is working on that. They've recently built some bridges to enable them to have some sort of trade with their neighboring countries. And a lot of the people in Tajikistan live outside the country. One of the main sources of income is actually money that is sent back into Tajikistan from people who are living outside. And a lot of the farming in Tajikistan is, or the people I should say, live simply by subsistence farming. They don't have the advanced trade networks. They don't have the resources that other countries like Kazakhstan have to make up for it. And so this is a country that is probably the least developed of all of these Central Asian countries, but it's trying hard to make connections with the outside world. All right, so that is basically it now for Central Asia. On Wednesday, we'll have a review thing looking over what we've talked about from Russia, what we've talked about from Central Asia, and the readings and such from the Caucasus. And then we'll have some sort of a test on Thursday, and we'll start looking then towards South Asia, which is basically India and the surrounding countries. So any questions on that?
You gave us Central Asian reading notes, right, Master Olson?
What's that?
You gave us Central Asian reading notes, right?
Yep.
Are we still supposed to do that?
Yep. So that one is only, that book only has like 2 pages on it, and it doesn't talk about the countries separately. It just sort of talks about them as a unit. So,
okay, and are we having a quiz on that or no?
Nope, that one's a little small, so it's more just you read it over and it kind of supplements what we talked about here.
Okay.
All right, so that is it for today.